Flying saucers, disappearing scientists. What next?
Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Huge thanks to the people that subscribe to the channel and to anyone that's watching the videos. And if you make a comment, that's lovely, because I can comment back and we can have a little conversation and all that. And sometimes I see other people reply to comments and stuff, so it becomes a real conversation, which is great. So thank you for all of that. I really appreciate it. This is a video that's a response to a video that Greg did at the channel Another Bibliophile Reads. It's a really good channel, check it out. I'll leave a link below. And he did a video about the suspension of disbelief. It's called something like, Can I Believe a Man Can Fly? Something like that. And it's about how he feels about how far he can take suspending his disbelief before he doesn't, he can't go along with it. He talks a little bit about what his limits are and just asks us, the people watching, what their limits are. And I thought it was kind of an interesting question, especially considering in general, the sort of stuff I read and the stuff I gravitate towards and the stuff that I really avoid reading as well. So I'm not really into realism, which is why it's kind of an interesting one for me to think about. But also, in my experience as a drama student learning about Brecht, that was my first encounter with the term suspension of disbelief when I was a teenager, and I think that's quite an interesting thing to talk about as well. So I wanted to talk about that before I talked about reading and talking about my experience with reading. I was going to use a few books to illustrate what I'm talking about, but first let's talk about Brecht for a minute. So Bertolt Brecht was a dramatist that has become a really significant voice in theatrical methodology. So he is very iconic in how he rewrote the rules, basically, when he wrote his plays. And his drive was a very political one, and he was trying to sort of wake the audience up, if you like. And his theory was all about reminding the audience as much as possible and as didactically as possible that they were suspending their disbelief. So what he was reacting to was what he thought was a theatre that had been happening beforehand, so like melodrama and the kind of soapy, like hysterical kind of drama that was all about relationships and didn't really motivate the public politically. That kind of thing. He was reacting to that, and he was saying that it was basically an opiate, and saying that it was sort of softening the audience so that they weren't they were kind of like, sleeping in their potential reaction to the world and politics and the way that we act to each other, all that kind of stuff. So Brecht was kind of seeing that he wanted to create a theatre that was different to that, and his theatre was kind of labelled didactic theatre, and it was all about the acknowledgement of the suspension of disbelief. And there's one kind of so quite often, basically, there'd be elements in the play, in the production, sometimes visually and sometimes in other ways, where the audience was reminded that it's a play, much like Magritte's painting that's got it's a pipe, and it's got underneath it, this is not a pipe. And it's not a pipe, it's a painting of a pipe. So there's lots of different ways in which different art forms have tackled this. And for Brecht, he used to sometimes get the characters to break the fourth wall. And breaking the fourth wall was a way in which, for him, it woke the audience up. So if they were just sort of letting it float past them and not engaging critically with the play, to break the fourth wall, the audience is then forced to acknowledge the fact that it's a play, and then they are, in his eyes, acting more critically with the art form they're watching. So that was when I first discovered the term suspension of disbelief. And I think it's I think Brecht is really fascinating, and I learnt a lot about that kind of thing from in those days, and it was kind of part of my political awakening as well. So Very fascinating thing, and if you feel like, oh, that's kind of interesting, I would recommend you see either a Brecht play or a Brechtian play, so a play that's been a production that's been influenced by his teaching. So, for example, another way that sometimes the audience is reminded it's a play is if there's hardly any set and some of the actors are playing different characters and that kind of thing. I saw a fantastic play back in those days, so I was probably 19 years old, I think, maybe 18 or 19, and I saw a fantastic play about the Peasants' Revolt, which I'm going to talk about in the Historathon. That's going to come up soon. I think that's in the next quarter. But the Peasants' Revolt in the 14th century, really, really important event, but quite a fascinating and complicated event. And I went to see a dramatisation of what happened. And basically the way that they produced it in the theatre, 4 actors, no set at all, and all 4 actors were just in overalls, and sometimes those actors played horses, and it was literally just you were constantly reminded that this was a play. And in Brecht's mind, that would have meant that you were able to look at the production more critically, and therefore look at the Peasants' Revolt more critically, and not just let it wash over you as entertainment. And it was a fantastic production. They were amazing, and it was really powerful in some moments. So something I've always remembered, but that's a very Brechtian way of putting a production on. So the suspension of disbelief is quite an interesting concept, because clearly Brecht thought that doing that made you a little bit passive in your reaction to theatre. But if I think about my reading, most of what I read is, or certainly the things I choose first and the things I get excited about, the things that are kind of make up most of my collection, if it's not non-fiction, is science fiction and fantasy. Science fiction and fantasy, by definition, requires you to suspend your disbelief. And I don't have a limit on how much I suspend my disbelief. And that's not because I'll just read anything, because it's got to work, it's got to be written well, I think. But really, ultimately, once you've gone so far, if I'm gonna be reading about something that's set on another planet, then if it's gonna, I guess if they did something now that was on Mars and we know that there's no life on Mars, then clearly you would be ignoring the fact it was on Mars to read the book, whereas in the old days you wouldn't know any better and you just crack on. So I guess, it helps if the author is aware that there are some limits to credulity, so that, for example, they wouldn't set something on Mars now that had loads of life on it. And if you think about Andy Weir's The Martian, which was set on Mars, Andy Weir did loads of research on how would he survive, what could he do, and that's where the drama comes in, because it is accurate, and it is potentially that's what you could get out of looking at the way that you could sort of work with the atmosphere and the conditions that he's on to try and sustain his life for a bit. All that stuff was through research and through looking at it scientifically. But I don't have a particularly scientific approach to what I read. My science fiction that I love doesn't have to be accurate. I firmly believe that science fiction shouldn't have to be accurate, in the sense that some people like to divorce the two things. So if science fiction becomes really inaccurate, they don't even like calling it science fiction anymore, they'll call it science fantasy. And for me, science by definition changes and we learn more as we go along. So I think you'll just end up dumping a lot of stuff away from science fiction, even if it was originally science fiction. And I just don't think that makes sense. That's just, like, to me, that's crazy, and needlessly complicated. So science fiction and fantasy, by definition, requires your suspension of disbelief. And if you think about two massive areas of science fiction and how you cannot let them entertain you without your suspension of disbelief, one of them, an obvious one, time travel. Time travel is not possible. It's been, the scientists today believe it's a lovely idea, but every single way they look at it, they can't see any scientific explanation, scientific rationale that would allow you to go to the past. It just doesn't. It doesn't compute scientifically. So whether or not, I mean, that's the thing about science fiction. The point is that in 300 years time, if there is some kind of way that you can do it, some substance that allows time to be a more fluid thing, then I don't know, maybe. But the point is, it's not possible. And time travel is such a fantastic device to use in stories. I love time travel, and I'm reading it being fully aware that it's not possible, but that's not really why you're reading the book. You're not reading the book because you want to explore something possible. You want to explore something impossible and something that's not very possible. So I think it kind of loses the point a bit if you're sort of analysing, well, how close to reality is this? If it's time travel, it's nowhere near very close. And you can definitely judge a book about its consistency, and I don't think it's about someone just writing random stuff. But quite often with science fiction and fantasy, most of what you're reading is completely far-fetched, and you're going with it. Same with the apocalypse. So even when they try and set up an apocalypse that is down to science, like the recent adaptation of the incredible game The Last of Us. So the setup for The Last of Us is a fungus that does kind of treat ants and other creatures in a way that it sets up in the show and the game that it does to humans. So there is scientific context, but it's still massively far-fetched, and you have to suspend your disbelief because clearly it hasn't transferred to humans. So the cause of the apocalypse has some scientific context, but it's very far-fetched scientific context, and that's fine. Usually the apocalyptic stories don't have any context, and it just happens, and you run with it because it's not really about the cause, it's about how we behave. That's what the apocalyptic stuff is all about. It's about human behaviour, and you're entertained by someone exploring what people are like and what humanity's like when it's desperate. And that's what stories are about, which I'm going to link this now straight away to this book, Blindness, by Jose Saramago. So Jose Saramago is an interesting writer. I will talk about him. I want to do a video just on him, but on about 5 of his books. And I don't think his prose is particularly inviting. He's quite a dry writer, but this is an amazing book. It's very, very strong. It's very brutal in places. It's very ugly. It's very distasteful. It's about the way that humanity completely falls apart when everybody becomes blind, and with a few exceptions. But basically, because people are blind, there's this way that people take advantage of each other, exploit each other, abuse each other, and it's an interesting exploration of humanity. Not a very positive one, but I think it's a fantastic book. But again, it's using the device where you have to suspend your disbelief to explore, for an author to think about, well, what are we like? What is our core being, and what would we do in this situation? That's what science fiction and fantasy is about, really. So even when certainly when it's that serious, I mean, even when it's fun and silly and frivolous, like the pulpy science fiction, it's still trying to be consistent in what we're like as people. But that is very clearly an example of an author exploring humanity, which is a really important thing, because there's a lot of social commentary in science fiction. I'd say, in my experience, there's less social commentary in fantasy, and I think fantasy is more about the wider definition of storytelling, when it's just about relationships and about hope and feeling good, about achievement, and something that's a little bit woollier than something that could be, a science fiction story attacking overpopulation or dystopia, or the developments in technology. Those kind of things are more real, tangible things that science fiction might be tackling with, but again, requiring your suspension of disbelief. So I was going to talk about The Lave of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is, again, a story that is totally far-fetched. It's about a man whose dreams become reality. So there's no scientific basis for this whatsoever. But for you to, it's a great book. It's one of my favourite books. But to enjoy this book, clearly you're not going, well, that's a bit silly. You're delving into that with an open mind, letting the story unfold. And it's really about how someone's lack of control and their sense of responsibility, their sense of being a small cog in a big world, all those kind of, there's all sorts of things that are being tackled by a central premise that is obviously nowhere near realistic at all. But it's a great, I mean, Ursula K. Le Guin always writes some really good commentary in her books, but the premise requires that you suspend your disbelief. Again, Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury, another one of my favourite books. And the point is with this, so this is about, like a classic kind of dark carnival, evil circus kind of device that's in a lot of books. But with this one, the circus allows you to go on this, what do they call it? Carousel. And if you go one way, you go backwards, you age backwards. And if you go the other way, you age forwards, and it changes your age, which is completely impossible. But the whole point is you're exploring age. You're exploring regret. You're exploring the resentment for being young. All those different things are talked about through the characters, and each character talks about that. And it's a fantastic book, but you cannot read this unless you're going to suspend your disbelief and believe that a carousel could do that. But you're going to do that because it's written beautifully, but more importantly, what Ray Bradbury is exploring is this sense of age and how we feel about it. Either how we feel about it when we're young or how we feel about it when we're old. So, again, the whole point of science fiction and fantasy is the reason why you're reading the book. You're not reading the book for the same reason you'd be reading a non-fiction book where you're trying to learn something. You're not trying to learn anything from a fiction book like that. You're exploring it and you're thinking about a concept, or you're exploring relationships, and it might enlighten you to some degree about relationships, but it's about the journey. It's always about the journey. So one more I was going to talk about, and that's Touch by Claire North. So Touch, which I've mentioned a few times on my channel, again, it's another one of my favourite books. And this is about a being that when they touch and someone else's body, they can become that person and live as that person for however long that being wants to, until they touch someone else and they want to transfer to that body. Clearly, you cannot read this and appreciate this unless you suspend your disbelief. But you're going to do that because of the sort of the thriller aspect of the story, the fact that when they do transfer to different bodies, Claire North has a fantastic way of making it seem so real with the way that there's like a sensual way of writing it. You know, the smells, the feeling of the body is different each time, and sometimes the being knows that the body is about to get ill or is already ill. And there's a different feeling in that body, and the sight's different, the hearing is different, all these different things, and it explores what we are, our identity, in the way that our senses work, and the way we relate to everybody, and the way we're treated is explored in this. So it's not just about suspending your disbelief because some random bollocks is going to happen. It's about exploring what humanity's like, what people are like, and what matters to us as people. So, social commentary and commentaries about relationships and about our own personal feelings are what reading is all about. And I do think that it's the bedrock of storytelling. And if you are going to be really picky about what you suspend your disbelief for, you're probably limiting what you can enjoy and what authors can really penetrate that cynicism, I think. yeah, it's an excuse. You know, for me, the plots are an excuse to explore what we're like as people, unless it's just a frivolous book that's there just to give you a thrill ride, an adventure thing, or to make you laugh. My last novel was literally just to make you laugh. It wasn't particularly deep, but my first novel was an attempt to be more deep. So hopefully that got somewhere with that. But you know, if you're reading something that requires your suspension of your disbelief, it's probably a book that is doing something more than just telling a silly story. Probably. Most books are like that. So there we are. That's my response to the idea of suspending your disbelief and what that's for, and why it's a good idea to do it, and why if you put limits on it, you might be putting barriers to the stuff that you read, and that's not necessarily a good thing, I think. Greg also mentioned Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It comes from, apparently the phrase does come from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and I thought it just worth mentioning that I absolutely love Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I've mentioned that in another video ages ago, and I really do love that poem, and it's something that really hit me when I was at school, and I've never forgotten it. I've always got a copy of it. I've got a few copies of it, and I think it's just such a brilliant poem. But again, completely fantastical, and what happens in that poem, in that story, could not possibly happen, but it's really dramatic. It's really vivid and powerful and brilliant. Love it. So Rime of the Ancient Mariner is a quite cool thing that you mentioned, and it's interesting that that's where the phrase comes from Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that. Please comment below if you have any thoughts on what I've said. If you believe time travel is possible, let me know, and I'll jump in your machine. We can have a little go. I'll see what happens, see where it takes us. That'd be fun. Thanks for watching. Bye.